In March 1986, Lou Reed walked onto a stage in Beijing's Workers Stadium and did something the Chinese government had explicitly forbidden him to do. What happened in the next 47 minutes would result in 8 hours of detention, classified interrogation transcripts that remained sealed for 33 years, and a diplomatic incident that nearly destroyed cultural exchange between the United States and China. The leaked documents, discovered by Laurie Anderson in Reed's personal archive after his death, reveal a confrontation between artistic freedom and authoritarian control that was far more explosive than anyone knew. Reed never spoke publicly about what Chinese officials said to him in that detention room, but the transcripts show a man who refused to compromise even when facing consequences that could have ended his career and his freedom. But before we dive into that Beijing stage where everything went catastrophically wrong, if you're fascinated by the moments when rock legends defied power and paid the price, subscribe to this channel. We uncover the stories that were too dangerous to tell while the artists were still alive. The story begins not in Beijing, but in New York, in late 1985, when Lou Reed received an unexpected invitation from the Chinese Ministry of Culture. China was in the early stages of opening to the West after decades of isolation, and the government was cautiously experimenting with cultural exchange programs designed to show the world that China was modernizing and becoming more open. The ministry had invited several Western artists to perform in Beijing and Shanghai as part of a festival celebrating international friendship and cultural understanding. The list included classical musicians, jazz performers, and a handful of carefully vetted rock artists who were considered safe enough to present to Chinese audiences without corrupting socialist values. How Lou Reed's name ended up on that list remains a mystery that suggests either profound ignorance about Reed's work or a catastrophic administrative error somewhere in the Chinese bureaucratic system. Reed's manager at the time was initially skeptical about accepting the invitation. China in 1986 was still very much a controlled society where the Communist Party maintained strict oversight of all cultural activities, where rock music was viewed with deep suspicion as a potentially subversive Western influence, and where artists who stepped out of line faced serious consequences. The contract sent by the Ministry of Culture was filled with restrictions and requirements that would have been unacceptable to most Western performers. Reed was required to submit his entire set list for approval 2 weeks before the concert, with lyrics translated into Mandarin so officials could review them for inappropriate content. He was forbidden from making any political statements on stage, from discussing Chinese domestic policies, or from deviating in any way from the approved program. The concert would be heavily monitored by cultural officials, and Reed would be accompanied at all times by government-appointed handlers who would ensure compliance with all regulations. Most significantly, the contract included a clause stating that if Reed violated any of these terms, the performance would be immediately terminated, and he would face unspecified consequences under Chinese law. Despite these draconian restrictions, or perhaps because of them, Lou Reed decided to accept the invitation. Friends who knew him during this period said Reed seemed almost amused by the challenge, curious about what would happen when his particular brand of artistic transgression collided with Chinese authoritarianism. He was also genuinely interested in Chinese culture, having recently become fascinated with Tai Chi and Eastern philosophy, practices that would later become central to his life. Reed saw the trip as an opportunity to experience China firsthand and perhaps to test the limits of what the government would actually tolerate. His manager tried to convince him to play it safe, to comply with all the restrictions, and treat the concert as a straightforward professional engagement. But Reed had never been good at playing it safe. He submitted a carefully sanitized set list for approval, songs that seemed innocuous enough on paper. But those who knew Reed's catalog understood that even his most seemingly harmless songs contained layers of subversion and challenge to conventional morality. The Ministry of Culture, lacking detailed knowledge of Reed's work and relying on cursory translations, approved the set list without understanding what they were actually approving. Lou Reed arrived in Beijing in early March 1986, stepping off the plane into a China that was barely recognizable to Western visitors. The airport was sparse and utilitarian, filled with propaganda posters celebrating socialist progress and workers' solidarity. Armed soldiers were everywhere, watching travelers with expressions that suggested suspicion rather than welcome. Reed was met by a delegation of officials from the Ministry of Culture, stern-faced men in identical gray suits, who greeted him with formal handshakes and immediately began explaining the rules he would need to follow during his stay. No wandering away from the hotel without official escort, no unauthorized conversations with Chinese citizens, no photography of military or government installations, and absolutely no deviation from the approved concert program. Reed listened to these instructions with his characteristic blank expression, dark sunglasses hiding whatever he was thinking, giving no indication of whether he intended to comply or rebel. The hotel where Reed was staying was one of the few establishments in Beijing that accommodated foreign visitors, a heavily monitored facility where every guest was watched and every conversation potentially recorded. Reed's room was comfortable by Chinese standards of the time, but stark by Western expectations, furnished with basic furniture and dominated by a large portrait of Chairman Mao on one wall. The handlers assigned to Reed were two young men who spoke limited English and seemed deeply uncomfortable with their assignment. They had clearly been briefed that Lou Reed was an important American musician, but they had no real understanding of who he was or what his music represented. They treated him with a mixture of nervous respect and confusion, unsure whether they were escorting a distinguished cultural ambassador or a potential troublemaker. Reed, for his part, seemed to take perverse pleasure in making them uncomfortable, asking questions about things he knew they couldn't answer, and making cryptic comments that his translators struggled to interpret. In the days before the concert, Reed was taken on carefully choreographed tours of Beijing's historical sites, visits that were designed to showcase China's cultural heritage, while keeping him away from anything that might present a less flattering picture of contemporary Chinese society. He saw the Forbidden City and the Temple of Heaven, walked along sections of the Great Wall, and attended formal dinners where officials gave long speeches about friendship between nations. Throughout these activities, Reed remained largely silent, observing everything with an intensity that made his handlers nervous. He was clearly absorbing details and forming opinions that he kept to himself. The only time he showed real animation was during a visit to a local market, where he briefly escaped his handler's supervision and spent 20 minutes talking with street vendors and ordinary Beijing residents, conversations that caused considerable anxiety among the officials responsible for monitoring him. When they finally located him and insisted he return to the official tour, Reed complied without argument, but something in his expression suggested that those unscripted conversations had given him information or inspiration that would prove significant. The concert was scheduled for March 15th at Beijing Workers Stadium, a massive venue normally used for political rallies and state-approved cultural events. The audience would consist primarily of carefully selected university students, Communist Party members, and foreign diplomats, all of whom had been thoroughly vetted to ensure they would respond appropriately to this experiment in Western cultural exposure. Chinese officials were nervous about the event, unsure how their selected audience would react to American rock music, and worried about maintaining control over an inherently unpredictable live performance. They had stationed security personnel throughout the venue and positioned cultural monitors near the stage with authority to stop the show if anything inappropriate occurred. The stage setup was minimal, just Reed's equipment and a sound system that Chinese technicians had struggled to configure properly, never having worked with this type of Western rock production before. Backstage, in the hours before the show, Reed was unusually quiet, sitting alone and smoking cigarettes while his handlers hovered nearby, periodically reminding him of the rules he needed to follow. When Lou Reed walked onto that Beijing stage at 8:30 in the evening, he faced an audience that had no context for understanding him. Most of the students in attendance had never heard Western rock music performed live, had no knowledge of Reed's history with the Velvet Underground or his solo career, and had been given only minimal information about what they were about to experience. They sat in neat rows, quiet and expectant, waiting to see what this American musician would do. Reed stood at the microphone for a long moment, looking out at the sea of unfamiliar faces, and something seemed to shift in his demeanor. The carefully controlled performance he had presumably planned to deliver suddenly felt inadequate to the moment. He started with one of the approved songs from his submitted set list, playing it exactly as the Ministry of Culture had authorized, and the audience responded with polite, uncertain applause. But then, as Reed launched into the second song, things began to change in ways that would have catastrophic consequences. The approved set list had included a sanitized version of "Walk on the Wild Side," with lyrics that had been carefully edited to remove references to drug use, prostitution, and sexual transgression. The Chinese translation submitted for approval had been deliberately vague, describing the song as being about colorful characters in New York City without specifying exactly what made these characters colorful. Reed began playing the song as approved, but midway through he made a decision that he must have known would trigger an immediate crisis. He stopped following the sanitized version and began singing the original uncensored lyrics, the verses about Holly and Candy and all the others, the references to hustling and sexual ambiguity and everything else that made the song both brilliant and completely inappropriate for a government-controlled concert in Beijing. The translators positioned near the stage to monitor his compliance immediately understood what was happening and began frantically signaling to officials that Reed was violating the approved content. But Reed kept singing, his voice carrying across the stadium as if daring anyone to stop him, and the audience, even those who didn't understand English well enough to catch every word, could sense that something transgressive and exciting was happening. Chinese officials backstage were in immediate crisis mode, arguing in rapid Mandarin about whether to stop the performance immediately or wait to see if this was an isolated incident. They decided to let the song finish, not wanting to create a scene by dragging Reed off stage in front of the audience and foreign observers, but they sent urgent signals that Reed needed to return to the approved program immediately. Reed finished "Walk on the Wild Side" to confused but enthusiastic applause, the audience responding more to his intensity and the sense of breaking rules than to the specific content they couldn't fully comprehend. He should have moved on to the next approved song, should have de-escalated the situation before it spiraled further out of control. Instead, Reed did something that documents suggest was completely unplanned and spontaneous, a decision made in the moment that transformed the evening from a minor protocol violation into a full-blown international incident. Reed stepped to the microphone and began speaking directly to the audience in English, with his nervous translator struggling to keep up and eventually refusing to translate what Reed was actually saying. He started talking about artistic freedom, about the right of people to express themselves without government control, about the importance of thinking independently and questioning authority. The content of his speech, reconstructed from multiple sources, including audience members who spoke English and secretly recorded fragments, was not explicitly anti-Chinese government, but it was implicitly challenging the entire system of cultural control that had made his presence in Beijing possible. Officials near the stage were now in open panic, shouting at Reid to stop, but he continued speaking, his voice growing more intense and passionate. The audience, even those who couldn't understand his words, could sense that something unprecedented was happening, that this American musician was saying things that were never said publicly in their country, and the atmosphere in the stadium became electric with a mixture of excitement and fear. The decision to forcibly end the performance was made within minutes of Reid's impromptu speech beginning. Security personnel began moving toward the stage, and officials were shouting orders to cut the power and clear the venue. But before they could reach him, Reid made one final gesture that would be remembered by everyone present and would dominate the leaked documents discovered decades later. He launched into a song that was definitely not on the approved set list, a raw and aggressive piece about rebellion and refusing to submit to control. The exact song has been disputed in various accounts, with some witnesses claiming it was an early Velvet Underground track, and others suggesting it was something Reid improvised on the spot. But what's certain is that he played for approximately 3 more minutes while chaos erupted around him. Security personnel reached the stage and began physically removing his equipment, cutting cables and shutting down amplifiers. But Reid kept playing on his acoustic guitar until the moment they actually grabbed him and forced him away from the microphone. The audience, shocked and confused, didn't know how to react, some standing and applauding while others sat frozen, terrified of being associated with this violation of official protocols. What happened after Lou Reed was escorted off that Beijing stage remained largely unknown for 33 years, hidden in classified government records and never discussed publicly by Reed himself. The leaked documents discovered by Laurie Anderson after Reed's death finally revealed the details of his 8-hour detention and interrogation by Chinese officials, a confrontation that was far more intense and dangerous than anyone outside the immediate situation had realized. Reed was taken to a room in a government building adjacent to the stadium, a windowless space with concrete walls where officials from the Ministry of Culture and State Security Services waited to question him. The transcripts, translated from Mandarin and released in fragmentary form by journalists who obtained them through sources in China, show a Lou Reed who was simultaneously defiant and calculating, pushing back against his interrogators while also understanding that he was in genuine danger. The officials questioning Reed were furious, viewing his actions as a profound betrayal of the cultural exchange program and a deliberate insult to Chinese hospitality. The lead interrogator, identified in documents only as Officer Chen, began by cataloging Reed's violations in meticulous detail, reading from the contract he had signed and pointing out each specific way he had breached its terms. Reed, according to the transcripts, initially responded with his characteristic sarcasm, making comments that his translators struggled to render into Mandarin and that clearly infuriated his questioners. But as the hours wore on, and the officials made clear that they were considering serious charges that could result in Reed being held in China indefinitely, his tone shifted. The transcripts show Reed beginning to engage more seriously with the questions, defending his actions not as deliberate provocations, but as artistic necessity, arguing that he couldn't perform with authenticity while adhering to restrictions that fundamentally compromised his work. The most revealing portions of the leaked transcripts come from the exchanges between Reed and Officer Chen about artistic freedom and state control, conversations that read like philosophical debates as much as interrogations. Chen argued that individual artistic expression must be subordinate to collective social harmony, and that foreign artists performing in China had an obligation to respect Chinese cultural values and political systems. Reed countered that art without freedom is propaganda, and that any government that fears honest expression is fundamentally illegitimate. These exchanges, documented in the sterile bureaucratic language of official transcripts, reveal both men articulating fundamentally incompatible worldviews, neither able to comprehend how the other could believe what they were saying. At one point, according to the documents, Chen asked Reed whether he understood that his actions could have negative consequences for future cultural exchanges and for other artists who might want to visit China. Reed's response, preserved in the transcripts, was characteristically blunt. He said that if China's price for cultural exchange was artistic castration, then no exchange was better than a dishonest one. Lou Reed was eventually released after 8 hours of detention, not because Chinese officials were satisfied with his explanations or because he had apologized for his actions, but because forcing the situation to escalate further would have created a diplomatic crisis neither government wanted to manage. American embassy officials had been alerted to Reed's detention and were applying pressure for his release, arguing that holding him would generate negative international publicity that would far outweigh any satisfaction China might gain from punishing him. The Chinese government, still in the early and fragile stages of opening to the West, was trying to present an image of a modernizing nation that could handle cultural diversity, and having to publicly prosecute an American musician for singing unapproved lyrics would undermine that carefully constructed narrative. The decision was made at high levels of the Ministry of Culture to release Reed with a severe warning, to cancel the remaining concerts that had been planned, and to declare him persona non grata in China indefinitely. The leaked documents include the final warnings given to Reed before his release, stark statements that he was being shown leniency he did not deserve, and that any further violations would result in immediate arrest and prosecution under Chinese law. Reed was informed that he was to leave China within 24 hours, that he was forbidden from making any public statements about his detention or the canceled concert, and that any attempt to communicate with Chinese citizens or journalists would be considered a hostile act. He was escorted back to his hotel under guard, allowed to collect his belongings under supervision, and then taken directly to the airport and placed on the first available flight out of the country. The officials handling his deportation made certain that Reed understood the seriousness of the situation and the genuine danger he had faced, warning him that other foreign visitors who had defied Chinese authority had not been treated as gently as he was being treated. Lou Reed returned to New York and never spoke publicly about what had happened in Beijing. When journalists asked about the China trip, he gave vague, dismissive answers that revealed nothing about the detention or the confrontation with officials. Friends and colleagues who tried to get details were met with Reed's characteristic refusal to discuss things he didn't want to discuss. The cancellation of the concerts was reported in music industry publications as a scheduling conflict or mutual decision, with no mention of the actual events that had led to Reed's expulsion from the country. The Chinese government, for its part, maintained complete silence about the incident, scrubbing it from official records and ensuring that state-controlled media made no reference to the concert or its aftermath. The entire episode was effectively erased from public knowledge, remembered only by the few hundred people who had been in Beijing Workers Stadium that night and the officials who had participated in Reed's interrogation. This deliberate silence on both sides meant that the true story of Lou Reed's Beijing concert remained hidden for decades, existing only as rumors and incomplete accounts that lacked verification or detail. Some music historians suspected something significant had happened, noting the abrupt end to what was supposed to be a multi-city Chinese tour and Reed's unusual reticence about discussing what should have been a notable career milestone. But without documentation or confirmation, the incident remained speculative, just another gap in the already complicated and often obscure history of Lou Reed's life and career. It wasn't until Laurie Anderson began going through Reed's personal archives after his death in 2013 that the classified documents came to light. Carefully preserved papers that Reed had somehow obtained and kept hidden for nearly 3 decades. The leaked transcripts and documents, released gradually starting in 2019 through journalists and researchers with access to Anderson and Reed's estate, finally revealed the full scope of what had happened in Beijing and why Reed had chosen never to speak about it. The documents showed that Reed's confrontation with Chinese officials had been far more serious than anyone outside the immediate situation had known, that he had faced genuine risk of long-term detention, or worse, and that the decision to release him had been politically motivated rather than a recognition that he had done nothing wrong. The transcripts also revealed that Reed's actions in Beijing had not been reckless provocations, but calculated choices, that he had understood the risks and had decided that artistic integrity was worth those risks, and that he had defended his position even when facing severe consequences. The release of these documents prompted renewed debate about Lou Reed's legacy and his commitment to artistic freedom. Some argued that the Beijing incident showed Reed at his best, willing to risk personal safety to defend principles he believed in and refusing to compromise even when facing an authoritarian government. Others suggested that Reed had been irresponsible and self-indulgent, that his actions had harmed the cause of cultural exchange and made it harder for other artists to work in China. What's undeniable is that the incident reveals aspects of Reed's character that complicated the mythology that had built up around him, showing him to be simultaneously brave and stubborn, principled and difficult, willing to pay real prices for his convictions, but also leaving others to deal with the consequences of his choices. The Chinese government's response to the leaked documents has been predictably hostile. Official statements have dismissed the transcripts as fabrications designed to embarrass China and damage its international reputation. State media has accused Laurie Anderson and Western journalists of anti-Chinese bias and of distorting a minor administrative matter into a false narrative about repression and censorship. But scholars and researchers who have examined the documents have found them consistent with other verified materials from the same period and have identified specific details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. The balance of evidence strongly suggests that the leaked transcripts are authentic, that they accurately represent what happened during Reed's detention, and that they provide a rare window into a confrontation between artistic freedom and state control that has profound implications beyond one musician's experience. Lou Reed never explained why he kept those documents secret for so long or what he intended to do with them eventually. Perhaps he saw them as insurance, evidence that could be revealed if China ever tried to rewrite the history of what happened. Perhaps he simply wanted a record of the confrontation, proof for himself that he had stood up for something important, even if he couldn't or wouldn't discuss it publicly. Or perhaps keeping the documents was Reed's way of maintaining control over his own story, ensuring that the full truth would eventually emerge, but only on his terms and in his timing. Whatever his reasoning, the fact that he preserved these papers and kept them hidden until after his death suggests that the Beijing incident mattered to him deeply, that it represented something significant about who he was and what he believed. even if he chose to let others discover that significance only when he was no longer around to explain or defend it. The leaked documents from Lou Reed's secret detention in Beijing reveal a story that challenges simplified narratives about artistic courage and political resistance. Reed's confrontation with Chinese officials was messy and complicated, a collision between incompatible worldviews that left nobody fully satisfied and everyone slightly damaged. But it was also a moment when an artist chose integrity over safety, when someone decided that speaking honestly was worth the risk of serious consequences, and when the machinery of state control confronted something it couldn't easily suppress or co-opt. That night in Beijing Workers Stadium, for 47 chaotic minutes, Lou Reed was exactly what he had always claimed to be: utterly uncompromising, willfully difficult, and absolutely genuine. The price of that authenticity was 8 hours of detention, permanent expulsion from a country he was genuinely interested in exploring, and decades of silence about an incident that would have fascinated his fans and enhanced his reputation. Reed paid that price without complaint and apparently without regret, and the leaked documents suggest he considered it a bargain.